So my name is Sam Mark Hall. I've just got promotion. I'm now the president of the Australian Native Bee Association. So we just had our AGM in November. So I'm the current president of the Australian Native Bee Association. So yeah, nice to meet other bee lovers out there. So I'm also I now work as a biodiversity officer for the city of Greater Bendigo, but my background is in research, really. So I've done a lot of research on bees, and on other pollinators as well, and birds and things as well. But I'm just going to concentrate on my first love tonight, which is the pollinators. So I want to talk a bit about generally about some of our native pollinators, and then a bit about some work that I've been doing to help restore their habitat. Firstly, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country. So most of you are probably on Warrarung or Wurundjeri land. I'm meeting from Dja Dja Wurrung country, but the work that I'm showing here was mostly collected on Dja Dja Wurrung and Tongarong country. So I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners, pay my respects to their leaders and elders, past, present, and emerging, and express my gratitude in the sharing of that land. So our ecosystems rely on pollination, on pollinators. Many of our native plants, as well as introduced plants and crops, rely on pollinators to set seed. So other than things like grasses and other things that are wind pollinated, most of our flowering plants require some sort of animal vector to move that pollen to reproduce in that way, to set seed. There's lots of ways that this can happen. There's lots of different animal groups that do this sort of pollination. And there's lots of sort of specializations. So particular insects that might visit particular plants, like orchids are a good example of that, where a particular orchid will attract a particular wasp or fly species to pollinate those. You get lots of nocturnal pollination. So things like fruit bats and possums are actually really good nocturnal pollinators. There's my favorite type of pollination is called buzz pollination or sonication, where you'll get something like this blue-banded bee up in the top corner there, top left-hand corner. Some flowers will hold their pollen really tightly and won't let it go. So the bees have to come in and they have to vibrate really quickly. Now the blue-banded bee has a great way of doing this. It comes in and it headbangs the flower really super quickly until the flower releases its pollen all over it. Most species of bee will release their wing muscles and vibrate really quickly to release that. So that's a really cool way when the pollen is harder to get. And then there's incidental pollination. So there's lots of species that will visit flowers and maybe drink the nectar and things, but they won't necessarily be there to pollinate, but they will collect some pollen on their body or shift that around just in their movement on the flowers. And of course, there are pollinators that rely on flowers. The bees are the main kind of ones that specifically rely on flowers. They co-evolve with flowers, and they have adapted special hairs that mean that they can transport the pollen there. But they also, bees need the nectar for sugar, for food, and they need the pollen for protein and to feed their young. So, and lots of other pollinators rely on parts of that for part of their diet, particularly as adults. So obviously we're all familiar with the European honeybee. It's kind of the first bee that people think of when you talk about bees. So I won't go through this too much because you're all acutely aware of what honeybees do. They make honey, they're a social species, they're great crop pollinators. We know lots about them because they're everywhere, and they're much loved. They're a complex superorganism. This is quite rare in the bee world, actually. Most of the bees that we have in the world are actually solitary bees, or have some maybe semi-sociality. So they might nest together or things like that, but certainly there's very few that have that kind of communal lifestyle that the honeybee has. They are introduced to Australia, so they're not native species to Australia. They perform an important function, but when we do get lots of feral colonies, they can compete for hollows and things with some of our native birds, and compete for resources with some of the other native pollinators. Usually it's not a massive issue. And obviously a lot of you will probably be concerned about the varroa mite incursion up in Newcastle at the moment. So I won't talk about that too much, but certainly there's some information you can get from the native bee perspective on our Australian Native Bee Association website, which I'll show you later. So we actually have about 2,000 species of native bee in Australia. That's really an estimate because there's a lot of bees in museums at the moment that haven't been identified. They haven't been given species names. So we don't really know. There could be 3,000 species maybe of bee. We've only, I think, identified about 1,700 or 1,800 at the moment, but we know there's lots of others around. So as I said, they're mostly solitary species, which means that an individual will be born, will go and forage, find some food, lay some eggs, mostly in the ground. So 70% of our native bees actually nest in the ground. Others will nest in sort of small holes in trees made by beetles, or small pithy stems, things like blackberry canes and lantana and that sort of cane where they can hollow it out and nest in those. So that's why when you see the bee hotels, they have those, they have canes and things that they use for those, because we have a lot of species that will also nest in those. But they'll lay their eggs in those individual cells. They'll provision it with a single sort of ball of food, lay the egg on top, the adult will die, and then the next season the young will emerge. So they don't have that kind of shared responsibility as adults. So our bees come in many sizes, shapes, colours, and particular habits. As I said, the majority nest in the ground. We also have 5 different families of bee in Australia, and some of them have very long lineages. They evolved in Gondwanan times. So actually we have the largest of our families, which makes up 50% of our bees, is the colletted bees. And they're quite unique to Australia, and they evolved during that Gondwanan time, and they really specialise on the plants of that period. So that's why you'll find them a lot on the eucalypts, and the callistemons, and some of the pea families and things, some of the older families of plant that we have. We also they have lots of specialisation. So you'll get some bees that have long tongues, some that have short tongues, and this obviously determines what sort of flowers they can visit as well, whether or not they can visit a daisy where it's nice and open, or they can visit those long tubular flowers to get the nectar from those. So lots of cool little features that our native bees have. And this is just some of the diversity of our native bees. The top left here is a megachilid bee. We call these leaf cutter or resin bees. And we call them that because they either use leaves or resin for their nest provisions. So leaf cutter bees will come and they'll cut a beautiful little semicircle out of your rose bushes or something, and they'll carry that back to the nest, and they'll use that to form their little nest cells in which they lay their eggs. The resin bees are called that because they collect plant resins and they seal up the entrance to their nests with those plant resins. In the top middle here, we have a teddy bear bee. Pretty self-explanatory why that's called a teddy bear bee, nice and big and fluffy. The top right here, we have a cuckoo bee. So much like the birds, the cuckoo birds that go and lay their eggs in other birds' nests, the cuckoo bee will lay its eggs in the blue-banded bee's nest, this bottom middle one. So it's kind of the lazy parent of the bee world. It'll sneak in there when the blue-banded bee's out foraging, and its young will emerge first and just eat everything else in there. The bottom left here, we have a carpenter bee. So they're very good at creating their own holes in wood. They love things like grass trees. They actually don't occur in Victoria anymore. They're still around in New South Wales and still around in South Australia, particularly on Kangaroo Island. Although the recent fires in Kangaroo Island a couple of years ago really impacted their population. So they're really trying to recover those. But they used to exist. They exist throughout Victoria, and there's talk of trying to reintroduce them back to somewhere like the Grampians. So we'll see how that goes. The blue banded bee I already talked about. They're the headbangers. And the bottom right-hand side is a little native stingless bee. So these actually don't occur in Victoria as well, or not naturally. but you can keep them in hives because they're a colonial bee. So we have about 11 or 12 species of stingless bee, really tiny, but they're amazing pollinators as well, very good at pollinating crops and lots of other native plants. And as their name suggests, they can't sting you. They don't have a functional stinger. So they're quite easy to use. They're being used a lot more in protected cropping environments, in glass houses and polytunnels and things now, because they're safe to use for the workers. Really good at pollinating crops like strawberry, raspberry, blueberry, those sorts of things. And they use them a lot in the macadamia farms up north as well. So this is just part of the nesting cycle. So I was describing it before, but this is a Liphotrichus bee here at the top left, and you can see this little burrow down into the ground, and all these holes are the little nest cavities. So each one of those, they will put in a little food ball, and they'll lay their egg on top, and then the egg will hatch. The larva will consume all of that food, and then they'll pupate, turn into an adult, and come out. So you'll get, maybe 10 individuals or something in a ground nest there. And this is up on the top right here is a wooden stem. So again, these nest cells that have been carved into those. I'm going to move this because it's move that down there. Yeah, so each one of those is sort of different stages there that have been laid. So again, you just have that life cycle of an adult laying the egg. That's for 1 to 3 weeks. The larva takes 4 to 5, several weeks of 4 to 5 stages, and then the pupate, and then the adults live for maybe 4 to 6 weeks, and then that resumes. Most of these bees only have sort of one life cycle in a year, each species. So you'll get the adult maybe coming out in early spring, living for 4 to 6 weeks. It'll die, and the pupa will go into diapause over the colder months and then come back out the next spring. And these are some of the other cool behaviours that I thought I'd talk about. This is the megachilid. Now, this is cutting off a pea petal, actually, so the same way that it would cut a leaf. But you can see it just uses these big jaws, the mandibles, to cut this beautiful semicircle there. We've got a couple of ground nests of our halictid bees here. So you can see they make these little holes in the ground, and they might have these raised kind of lips. So they can be quite obvious in some parts. Some of them, they'll just be in your garden on the edge of the grass where it meets a garden bed or something. You might have some holes and just a little bit of raised earth, and there'll be some native bees nesting there. This bee in the middle here is doing sonication or buzz pollination. So tomato flowers hold their pollen really tight. They have porocidal anthers, and it will shake that really violently to kind of get the pollen to come out into its body. In the top right hand here, we have a group of male blue-banded bees, and they will roost together in the nighttime while they're waiting to breed. They'll just they'll find a stem somewhere and all sort of cling to it with their mouth parts overnight, and can do that a lot. This one in the bottom right hand corner is a masked bee, the hyliine bees they're called. So they have usually a coloured mask, which makes them quite easy to determine. They have a really cool sort of habit of, they like to ingest all their supplies. So they drink a lot of nectar. Obviously, they're not as hairy. They kind of mimic wasps more than bees. They'll drink a lot of nectar, but they want to concentrate that as much as possible. So actually, they'll drink a lot, and they'll go and sit on a leaf or a stick or something, and they'll start blowing bubbles of that, and they want to evaporate as much of the water off that nectar as possible to concentrate that nectar. So it's really cool when you see them just sitting on a leaf blowing bubbles. I just wanted to show you a quick video of another behaviour. So this is a native halictid bee, and this is a pea flower. So these bees are very good. You see how when it lands, it moves those the petals apart at the bottom, and that forces the stamen up, which means that the pollen is being deposited on the underside of the body of the bee here. So it's You can see it here moving around. It'll jump on this. I think this is the best one here to get a good view. And you can see there, and it comes right up underneath and deposits that pollen underneath. So really very, very effective. And then you'll see here that it uses that forelegs and they scrape a lot of that pollen that they're getting at the same time back to their back legs to carry. So you'll see a lot of our native bees do carry that pollen on the back legs still, or on the underside of their abdomen. But there it is again. So you can really see how it's very effective at pollinating these flowers while it's getting its feed of nectar. And I just want to compare that to, we've got the European honeybee also visiting these flowers, just for a bit of comparison here. You'll notice that the honeybee has a different approach to collecting its nectar. So it's coming all sorts of angles. It doesn't like to land on top of the flower. So it's doing what we'd probably call nectar robbing. So it's actually not getting much pollen on it. It's just trying to get its nectar feed here. So very rarely actually exposes those anthers to get the pollen. I'll just skip forward again and see. Having a lovely time getting some nectar, but actually not being particularly effective at pollinating these sort of pea flowers. So these are ones that really rely on some of our native bees, these peas. But of course, bees aren't our only pollinators. So I just want to quickly go over some of our other important pollinators. So flies are a really good group of pollinators. They contribute to not only pollination, but to predation and nutrient cycling and things in our systems as well. Hoverflies, the top left-hand one here. So there's a number of different hoverfly species. They're bee mimics, so they have this yellow and black abdomen to try to ward off predators. So they look like honeybees. But they are probably the best pollinators outside of the bees. Really effective, and they actually forage in colder weather as well, which makes them very good for some of our winter flowers and things like that. You also get this, so the drone bee down here on the big picture on the bottom right as well. Also a bee mimic, any that have that sort of coloration and shape. But flies are very obvious. They have these huge eyes that's very distinctive, that take up all of their head basically. And they can be very small as well, in lots of different shapes and sizes. This robber fly up here in the top middle, the longer flies, they're very good predators. They're up there with dragonflies for predating on things. In fact, quite good at predating European wasps even, which is nice if you want to control those. So a lot of these have liquid diets. They'll drink pretty much anything, including nectar, but also that some will drink rotting plants and animals, some blood, obviously mosquitoes and things will drink people's blood. There's one group that are specialised on wombat poo. So there you go. But they can be a vector for disease. So people, have a bit of a love-hate relationship with flies. But as far as pollination goes, they're very, very effective. Butterflies and moths are probably the group that people are most familiar with, because we see lots of butterflies around. They're colourful. They're sort of a lovely thing to kind of see in springtime. They're active day and night, so mostly butterflies are active in the day and moths at night, but there are some day-flying moths as well. They live across all sorts of habitat and structures, so they're very good at pollinating at different heights, at ground level, up in the canopy, and everything in between. They can travel great distances. There's migration that occurs, so they're very good sort of long-distance pollinators as well. They do require a host plant for larval development, so it's really important when we're talking about pollinator habitat, not just to think about flowers and food resource, but we want some other plants. Say, for instance, there's some species that lay their eggs on mistletoe that hangs off particular eucalypts, so they need that for their larval food. So trying to see all of these other resources as being important for pollinators as well. Another kind of cool thing about butterflies is that males will do what we call hill topping. So in the springtime, often A lot of males will kind of migrate to the tops of hills and fly around and do some sort of dances to attract females. Obviously, it's quite a successful strategy. Don't really know much about the behaviour other than we see that happening, and it's obviously a chance for some of these males to actually find a mate. And some of them actually have mutualism. Some butterflies have co-evolved this mutualism with ants, where the ants will protect the caterpillars, so defend them from predators, and the caterpillars will secrete a substance to feed the ants, for instance. So there's all these kind of interesting behaviours that happen in the pollinator world as well. Beetles, very quickly, they make up a quarter of all known animal species, so they're a super abundant group. They don't look like they'd be particularly good pollinators, but actually they're some of the most efficient pollinators. Because of their sheer numbers, they do a lot of activities on plants. Some of them mate on plants, some of them will feed on them, some of them will predate other insects that visit the flowers. But they're very good at carrying bits of pollen and quite efficient with that pollen when they go and visit the other plants in dispersing that. And obviously ladybirds, things control pests as well, such as aphids, all those kind of things. So really interesting group. And then we have wasps. People often think of the European wasp, or they think of angry, aggressive wasps, which we don't really have too many of. They're actually quite good at pollinating as well. A lot of them visit flowers to feed on nectar, but they will predate on other insects and things to feed their young. And they can be solitary or they can be social. So you have these sort of paper wasps that create these little nests and raise their young together, much like honeybees and other social insects. And they can travel quite a distance, so they're actually quite good long distance pollinators as well. And then finally, we've got some other insect flower visitors. We have things like earwigs and grasshoppers and ants and spiders and true bugs, some of our stink bugs and shield bugs and things that will visit flowers quite readily. They probably don't do a lot of pollination. Ants possibly do a bit of pollination, certainly in small distances on a plant or between a couple of small plants, but because they don't fly, they don't travel huge distances. Most of these will just use them as perches. Grasshoppers and things, earwigs might be predating on things there. Stink bugs and shield bugs might go on there to mate. They can release scents and things to deter other visitors. And of course, flower spiders are very good at hunting pollinators on flowers. So they'll sit and wait and be quite disguised, and then they'll get a feed out of it. So there's lots and lots of insects that visit flowers. And of course, we have lots of other things like birds, small possums, bats, that all visit particular flowers. And again, you can see here we've got eucalypts and we've got bottle brushes and banksias and things like that that are most visited by these sort of groups. So they play a really important part in maintaining those plant communities as well. But there's lots of threats to our pollinators. The most obvious one is land use change. So we go from sort of forest, we clear our forest habitat to create housing and agricultural land, which are obviously important land uses for us, but they do really change the habitat of bees. And there's evidence to show that when you move from a forested habitat to an agricultural habitat or modified habitat, you go from a very diverse and abundant insect community to a quite a modified, simplified community with only a few species there. So we are sort of changing those lands, and then if you look to central Victoria, this is a photo from central Victoria, these are the kind of landscapes we have left there, where you've removed a lot of the forest and our insects have to rely on sort of these long linear strips along creeks and along roadsides, and then farmland. So maybe there's cropping or grazing. There'd be some weeds and things that they can feed on. There might be big patches of bushland up in the back there. But it's these kind of heavily modified landscapes. And these are the sort of landscapes that fascinate me in terms of trying to figure out where pollinators are within those and what they do there. So there's all sorts of things that they could be in. There's also lots of homes in these rural environments. So you've got a home that often has a garden, which has nice structure, lots of colourful plants, water supplies and nesting sites if people have put up insect hotels or have left some bare ground for our ground nesters. There can be all sorts of things there. And usually then these houses are connected to maybe this bushland up in the back by some of our native plants, our paddock trees and our roadside vegetation and some native grasslands and waterways and even railway lines and things that are left there. So there can be areas of great floral abundance out there to support communities, but we still don't know a lot about where they are in these kind of modified landscapes and how we kind of create really diverse communities where we have lots and lots of different species. So I suppose a question I've been trying to ask is, how do we increase pollinator diversity across these landscapes? And if we look to Europe, they do a great job of creating these sort of wildflower meadows and things. They plant a lot of flowering plants under power lines, next to farmland, next to roadsides. So just creating this kind of smorgasbord for their insects. And then they get lots of things, obviously butterflies and flies and things as well. And then if you're in an urban environment, then gardens, home gardens and nature strips and things become really important habitat just to create that floral abundance for them and a number of nest sites, you know, whether it be trees or whether it be the ground that's left around the plants that things can nest in. And a good example of this, if people are aware, there's the Melbourne Pollinator Corridor project. So there's a group that are trying to create a pollinator corridor between the Royal Botanic Gardens and Westgate Park. So you've got the city centre right here, but they think there's opportunity here to really connect those up and create a really nice pathway between these two bits of sort of bushland. And all these dots here are people that have got involved by planting out the nature strips or their gardens to kind of create that corridor. So really interesting project if you're interested in looking that up further and seeing how that progresses. So that's something you can do in urban environments. So it's great to have these kind of corridor projects. It's a really good way of looking at how we build diversity. But first we need to know where pollinators are and what they're pollinating. So a couple of years ago, I teamed up with the Upper Campaspe Landcare Network. So this is a landcare network, 16 different landcare groups based from the Macedon Ranges. The Mount Macedon's down here in the bottom right-hand corner, right up to almost Castlemaine, Harcourt area, up to Reedsdale, so almost up to Bendigo. There, so quite a large area, down to Trentham, Dalesford sort of area here. Almost across the Lance field. So just to give you a sense of that area. So I joined up with them. They were really keen to create pollinator corridors, as I said. They freely admitted that as a landcare group, they're very good at recreating canopy cover, so planting trees along creeks and those sorts of things. But they haven't been so good at creating the other structure, the understory that our pollinators need. To find lots of resources. So I teamed up with them while I was doing some research at Western Sydney Uni. So I'd come down, I grew up in Gisborne, so just to the south there, south of Macedon. So it was a familiar area to me. And I really wanted to sort of see how we could create these pollinator corridors effectively. And the thing I really like about this landscape is that you've got all this bushland right around. It's almost kind of encircled by bushland. So it means you can connect up those populations quite well if you do it well. So all of these yellow dots here, the pins, are properties that we went to, and we went and did some surveys of what pollinators were there. So there's 60 odd sites. We looked in people's gardens, we looked along waterways and grasslands, on roadsides, mown or grazed areas, the areas where people will mow the lawn, or they might have cattle or things grazing on them. So presumably you wouldn't get too many flowers there. And then you'd have remnant bush as well. So we wanted to compare all of these sites and see what we could get. So I enlisted some volunteers here. These are a couple of environmental science graduates from Melbourne Uni and Deakin Uni. And really a very simple experiment. We got a tape measure, we rolled it out 50 meters, and we did a 10-minute survey of 50 meters by 2 meters. We had a net, we had some recording equipment. We recorded lots of environmental conditions, but then we walked along that tape measure. We looked at whatever insects were visiting particular flowers. We'd catch those so we could identify the insect, and we'd identify the flower that they were on as well. So we did this across all of these sites several times. So here's in the bush as well. There's Ash catching something off these paper daisies here. This is a sort of a market garden next to a vineyard where you can see it's just it's an open country around there. And again, we identified things like these lycotriches here, and this is a halictid bee on a weed species, on a cape weed. Very common sort of species around, and they'll visit anything. So we wanted to know whether or not they were native species they were visiting, or veggies, or weeds, or whatever. All of these things that can build our knowledge about where our native bees are and what they're visiting. We also stuck up these traps because obviously we're only at the site for a very short period of time. So we wanted to also see what was there when we weren't around. So we put up these vein traps, they're called, yellow and blue ones. They're just a color attractant. Insects will be attracted to the colors, and they'll fly inside the trap, and then their behavior means that they just can't figure out how to get out again. So they end up dying in those traps. Not so good for the insects, but good for us to know what's around. We only leave them out for 4 days, so it's just collecting a few extra things. And then we'd pin the insects. So we've got a masked bee up the top, we've got our cuckoo bee, and we've got our leafcutter bees there, and lots of other things that we collected. And then obviously we had to identify things. So we spend a lot of time pinning and identifying things. Insects are quite complicated. Often you have to look down a microscope. So you've got this little megachilid. This is a male leafcutter bee. You can tell it's a male because it's got these modified forelegs with these feathery kind of structures. They actually use those for mating. When they were mating with the female, they'll put those over the eyes of the female, presumably as a way of calming her or something. They actually have a black circle on the inside of there, so it looks like an eye looking back at the female. But yeah, this only occurs in the megachilid bees, in those leafcutters. And we've got, so this is on the bottom right here, this is John Walter. He's the president of the Upper Capacity Land Care Network. He's a very good macro photographer, so he was out there taking lots of photos as well of all the insects and the flowers, so that we had that sort of database of what was out there. And I just wanted to show this because this kind of shows how difficult identification of insects can be sometimes, particularly our native bees. These are all the first three going from the left are Exonura bees or reed bees. So they nest in canes, pithy stems. Now, very difficult to distinguish. They all look very similar. They have a red abdomen, they have a black body. Usually you need these facial markings to differentiate species. Now these two are a bit different in their face markings, the two on the far left. The third one along is certainly quite different. It's a bit smaller, and it's got a little bit of only a small bit of coloration on its lip. And then you have this mimic here, this is actually a fly on the far right. It has the same coloration as all of these species, but the big eyes give it away, the little antennae. It's a bigger individual anyway. So that's a fly that's trying to mimic these bees. And in fact, these were all caught in one net sweep off a plant. So they're all foraging together. But could well be 4 different species, could be 2 species, 3 species. We don't know. It's very, very hard to get really good IDs on these, which is why we don't know how many native bees we have in Australia, really. Just really quickly, what can we learn from these, I suppose? Well, really, we found that gardens are very good at supporting our native bees all year round. So we did some in autumn, in early spring, in late spring, and in summer. And all of those seasons, we had better richness in our gardens. The richness meaning the number of species there. Mown areas weren't particularly good because they didn't have many flowers, but in early spring, you might get a flush of some of the weed species that would bring them on. Some of our remnant bushland are really good in the springtime. So they kind of stay pretty still, not a lot of flowering. And then suddenly in spring, you'll have this burst. Same along some of our roadsides and in our grasslands, the Themata that I've got written here are grasslands. And they'll have this flush in the spring. So that's a good thing because most of our bees will kind of emerge in the spring. But also important finding that we found that gardens can sustain them year round because they have lots of flowers year round, lots of resources there. Probably means that we need to try to connect those communities up to these other areas or restore our remnant bush and our grasslands and things with species that might flower at different times of the year to support those bee communities. Because I did say they only kind of emerge once a year usually, but there are some species that can have two life cycles in a year. So they'll come out in spring, the adult will die off, the young, if the conditions are good, they might emerge in the autumn and then have another generation and then the spring. So if we can create habitat that where there's that year-round flowering, then we might be able to sustain better populations there. This is just the abundance. So again, the abundance, the number of overall individual bees there, heaps more in gardens than there were in other areas. But again, those kind of grasslands and bushland were really good in the springtime. And it corresponded with our number of flowers in these areas. The gardens always have lots and lots of flowers available to the bees. And in the springtime are the only times when our native bush sites tend to have lots of flowers for them. And same with abundance. We have super abundance of flowering plants in gardens, not so much in the other sites except for in the spring there. So those bush, they really come into flower. And a lot of those will be eucalypts and bottle brushes and things like that have lots and lots of flowers anyway. The grasslands, more kind of diverse understory sort of plants, but a lot of things that will come up. So some really interesting things that we're finding. One of the key things we really want to do is work out exactly what plants are visited by which species so that we know which ones to plant to create these pollinator corridors. So we need to make decisions about, well, do we want the most diversity? Do we want the most sort of different species? Do we want bees that have specialized interactions with particular plants? So ones that will only visit a particular pea flower or an orchid or something? Do we want bees with different traits? Do we want bigger bees, smaller bees, short-tongued, long-tongued, all of those? So do we want to encourage as many of those as possible? Do we want ones that visit eucalypts flowers at the top of the canopy, but also ones that visit the ground cover, little flowers in grasslands? And do we want ones across all of the seasons? So they're the sort of questions we're trying to work out. And then we're trying to work out then how do we create these corridors? This is an example in Trentham, one of the sites where they removed all the woody weeds there, and then they revegetated along that site. So again, they were like, well, which plants, do we put ones that will grow easily because they can adapt to that climate? Do we just want native species, or do we want anything that will attract pollinators? Again, do we want ones specifically that attract the rare species back to these areas, or just do we want lots of abundance and diversity of bees? So we collected well, not myself, but people in the land care. We have some seed savers there. They go around collecting lots of native seed. They sold that to the land care, who now has all this seed bank. They're doing lots of workshops with landowners, creating seed balls that they can put out in properties and trying to grow as many of these plants as possible, specific to each habitat that they're doing. So they'll have a particular group that they might put out in grasslands, particular ones they might put out in native bush or roadsides. Obviously in gardens, they kind of deal with themselves. People are always happy to put all sorts of things in their gardens. And the aim really is to create this kind of bush that we've got on the left-hand side. That's a picture from Bendigo, where I work, a site that I took people out a couple of weeks ago to have a little bit wander through the bush and look for insects. But you can see there's flowering plants right from the ground cover right up to the canopy, and really good dense structure. So it's very good for lots of things. There'll not only be flowers for the bees, there'll be nest sites there. There'll be host plants for other insects as well, like butterflies. And of course, the aim is to create more of these linkages to join this garden up to this native bush at the back there, and make sure that there's lots of different habitats along the way, so that we're getting the sort of bee diversity that we've got in our gardens, that we get that across the whole landscape, and make sure that we're really promoting as many pollinators as possible. So the next step really is, how do we measure the success of those corridors? Now, obviously, this is pending time and money. We're doing another survey in the next few weeks, now that spring, it's finally warm enough that things are coming out. But we do want to do this long term. We haven't got funds at the moment to continue it on regularly, but we are looking for more funds, particularly as the Landcare is doing lots of the planting now. We want to measure the success of those plantings with how quickly and how well they support our pollinators. So we're going to keep going out and doing some surveys as much as possible. But there's lots of other ways that the community that we're working with, they get involved through an iNaturalist group. I don't know if people are familiar with iNaturalist, an online database there where you can take photos of insects or anything really, upload them to there, and then others can get on and help you identify those. This has been a really useful resource for us. We've actually had over 1,000 observations, many hundreds of species that we've got there. So that's also a really good tool. We've just set it for that area, but a really good way of us finding out what else is there when we're not able to get to those sites ourselves. So the more eyes on these insects, the better. So people are getting involved, trying to get involved in surveys now. These are the sorts of things people could do anywhere, just going out and looking for insects, taking photos, uploading them to sites like our naturalists, give us an idea about where things are and what they're visiting, because usually you take a photo of them on a flower or something, so it gives us that information as well. There's all sorts of things. The Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, the Atlas of Living Australia are also really good. There's a twice yearly wild pollinator count. It's a citizen science event where you can count pollinators on flowers, just literally going into your garden and looking at some flowers for 10 minutes and recording what's there and uploading those. That's now on iNaturalist as well, so you can visit that on iNaturalist, or you can look at Wild Pollinator Count website. The key things you can really do for pollinators, they need two things. They need plants for food, they need flowering plants, and they need nest sites. So ground that's not turned over too much, that not totally mulched, but some bare areas there that they can get into more easily, usually around the edges of paths or next to rocks and logs and things. They like to get in somewhere a bit kind of safer as well. You could join with your neighbours around like the Melbourne Pollinator Project to create these nectar networks, create these linkages. And of course, it's important to monitor these changes over time. You know, we want to see more species, we want to see more of them, we want to see better plant health and more veggies in our gardens, those sorts of things. So we want to see the tangible benefits of these. But yeah, the more eyes, the better, and the more flowering plants and things we can have in the garden that flower year round, then the healthier our bee populations are going to be. Now, some of the photos and things that I've showed today and some of the information you can find in this guide, The Insects of Central Victoria. So even though we created this as part of this project, but all of the insects that you find there will be down in Melbourne as well, quite common species. So you can find that at this website here on the Upper Capacity Landcare Network website. We also developed a plant selection for pollinating insects. In some ways it's specific to this region, but again, it can be pretty general. So you'd find some similar species anywhere across Victoria that you could plant there. And if you wanted to know a little bit more about the project, you could have a look. The Upper Campaspe Landcare Network have got some flyers and things as well that just tell a bit more about that project. So that's it from me. I just want to say thanks to all of the agencies involved in this, particularly the Upper Campaspe Landcare Network. John Walter and Beth Ritchie have been really driving this project and do some great work in terms of restoring habitat. Sponsored by Macedon Ranges Shire and the City of Greater Bendigo and Wombat Forest Care. I was working at Western Sydney University, so bringing the research from that. And of course, as I said at the start, I'm the president of the Australian Native Bee Association now. We're always welcoming new members. If anyone's interested in native bees as well, please have a look at our website, and always happy to chat with other groups like yourselves as well about how we can conserve all bees and help support the beekeeping industry as well. So thanks very much.
Can because most of us have Apis mellifera, can they coexist with these native bees? Having just visited the Grampians, all I could see was Apis mellifera, but I'm only looking for them. So, yeah.
Look, they absolutely can coexist. The thing with this season, it's been quite cold and a bit wet, so you will get Apis mellifera out a lot more. And you'll get lots of the hoverflies and other flies. You'll get moths more than you will all the others. It's only really been the last couple of weeks when it's been sunny and warm that I've started to see the native bees coming out a bit more. So yeah, the last couple of years being La Nina have meant that the bees aren't as active, the native bees, until later. So from now on, really, for the next few months, we'll get a lot of native bees. But then as things turn back to warmer, drier conditions, you'll see a lot more native bees earlier on in the season as well.
Mark, thank you. Fantastic presentation, mate. That was awesome.
That's all right, no worries.
I'm glad it's being recorded so I can have a look back over. I'm down in East Gippsland. I'm on the western fringe of East Gippsland, and I have noticed a number of native bees around our area. I've just got about 6.5 acres. We've got a lot of veggie garden, probably about 10 metres by 20 metres, and we have a lot of native bush near us. We've got a lot of paddocks. I'm wondering, of all the native bees, you mentioned that a lot of them are no longer in Victoria. Is there a particular species of bee that you would like to see more of in Victoria or come back to Victoria? And the follow-up question is, how do we do that?
All right, good question. So yes, some of the ones that I've specifically mentioned aren't in Victoria, but we do have a lot. A lot of the species of native bee do still occur throughout most of the East Coast. But our native bees typically they're sort of more abundant in the tropics. You get a lot more there, and actually you get a lot of bee diversity out in the deserts in Central Australia. There's just something about the conditions there that we have a lot of native bees there. So we do have a lot here. The simple answer is, in terms of getting more back, exactly what I said. Really, we just need to create the habitat for them. They don't need much. We really need to connect those areas where you're going to have a lot of bee species, like the bushland, where they've been able to hold on, and kind of mimic that throughout the landscape. Try and create as much diverse habitat for them as possible to bring back those, to bring them back into areas that they're not currently there. In terms of species I'd really like to see back, I would love to see the carpenter bee back in Victoria. If we could connect those habitats up from Kangaroo Island up to New South Wales, that would be a great success story. They're an amazing little group of bees, the carpenters. Really, beautiful, shiny, have a very loud buzz. You can't really mistake them. I'd love to see the carpenter be back. We are actually trying to establish a bit of a project where there's a group of bees called the spring bees or Trichocoletes. They're around everywhere. They're across the whole country, but they specifically visit these pea flowered plants. So we're trying to get up a project with the Bee Association and other groups to kind of highlight this particular group. Maybe we're thinking of having a Peas for Bees kind of initiative where we're encouraging people to plant more pea flowers to encourage the spring bees back. And that will have lots of flow-on benefits to lots of other species as well. So that's the kind of thing we would like to do, just to really highlight one or two species that will probably benefit everything.